So I'd like to first just start you thinking about speech. So speech is a very natural way of interacting. I think for me, one of the most obvious ways of demonstrating that is the fact that we've all written papers about the research that we're presenting, but we fly halfway across the world to talk to each other about them, to interact with each other and to hear audibly the sorts of things that we're interested in. One of the ways of us doing that, one of the reasons for us doing that, is because it is an incredibly natural way of interacting. Pretty much since the invention of computing, we, as humans, have been dreaming of ways of naturally interacting with computers in the same way that we interact with each other. And we, as designers, as HCI researchers and computer scientists, have been fascinated with speech for many years as well. This is one of the very earliest speech systems which could recognize maybe 10, 15 words, but there have been massive breakthroughs in recognition, in speed, in flexibility over the past decades, as I'm sure you all know. Today's systems, like these, are what most of us are familiar with. For you and I, this is currently the sort of state of the art in speech. Either we have an app on a phone, like these examples here, or a sort of speech appliance, like one of these two systems, or many others. The sort of thing that you plug in your home or your office, you leave unattended, and just ask it queries whenever you want. Out of interest, who has one of these devices in their home or office or anywhere like that? Okay, probably about 50% of people. So I'm sure you got plenty of feedback about their utility, the usability, the way they work, how good they are. But that's not what I'm specifically going to be talking about here. Instead, I'd like you to think about speech appliances and then cast your mind far away from the sort of places that you use those to here. So this is Dharavi, which is one of the largest slums in Asia, in the world, in fact. And it's about a square mile or a couple of square kilometers, but there are just under 1 million people living in that space. So it's incredibly densely populated. Because of this, a Dharavi resident typically lives in a single room home, a very compact area. Most areas are shared spaces, and there's less access to the sorts of constant power and network connectivity that you and I are typically familiar with. And at first glance, it doesn't really sound like the sort of place that a speech appliance would naturally be very appropriate, or even very probable. But actually, when you think about it, speech as a modality is the sort of thing that does sound particularly useful. And as lots of us in HCI have observed and have investigated, speech does seem appropriate for the sorts of emergent users of technology who aren't necessarily familiar with the sorts of typical interactions that have been designed, or may have perhaps lower literacy or familiarity with interface concepts. So speech does seem potentially attractive. So the questions that we ask in this paper are around how might those sorts of speech appliances that I just showed work in this sort of context. And this work was inspired by a great, really inspiring series of work by Sugata Mitra, who was a researcher at IIT Delhi, who in the early 90s cut a hole in the wall, the boundary wall of IIT, and inserted a computer in the wall, but facing outwards. So his idea was that anyone in the street might come up and just interact. He didn't give any instruction, just let people experiment. And what he found was that very quickly, people, children especially, as you see here, just figured out how to interact, and within a pretty short period of time had explored a huge number of the features of that device. So in this work, we were inspired by Sugata Mitra's work and wondered whether this same sort of public space approach might work for speech appliances. So rather in public or private spaces, if we put a speech device in, say, a public square or an alleyway or a place where lots of people interact, how might it work? Would it be useful? Would people use it? So in the rest of this talk, I'm going to briefly talk about how we designed this deployment that we did, a probe that we deployed in public spaces in Maravi, and also some of the results, so how people ended up using this deployment, and some potential design considerations for future deployments just like this. So we were inspired by the hole-in-the-wall work, but took a slightly different approach at the start. We ran a series of design workshops in Maravi to help us and residents of Maravi think about how speech might work in public spaces. And we were focused specifically on designing technology for the far-off future. Speech was just one of the things we looked at, but that's what I'll focus on here. We worked with groups of Maravi residents and started by demonstrating or getting them to use typical speech systems like the ones I showed at the start of this talk. And then we went on a series of what we call technology walks. And what I mean by this is walking with groups of participants around Maravi and thinking about where speech appliances might play a part. So where you might place it, when someone might interact with it, how you might make that interaction, or why, what sort of questions and answers might be provided. We did this also by kind of role-playing some of these interactions. One participant would hold the speech device, maybe where they think it might be placed, and others would ask them questions, and they'd be able to respond in the same sort of way they saw the speech appliance responding. And then we, after that, reflected with participants about some of the sorts of use cases, the practicalities, the potential services they saw being developed. So just a few of the key insights from those workshops. One of the obvious things that participants pointed out was the practicalities of deploying a speech appliance in Maravi. There are things that don't apply in your home or office, like the monsoon season or the very dry season. The rain and the dust would obviously be quite detrimental to a speech system initially. There are other things about security. So the participants suggested we hide valuable components away and just have a cheap speaker and microphone. There are other things around noise. Maravi is not a quiet place. Participants also discuss some of the contextual sensitivities that we would have to think about. So if you're in a public place with one person or a few people or many people, there are things that you're going to have to modify in terms of basic aspects like the volume of the device. If you're near to a church, for example, this is one of the examples, you wouldn't want to be playing loud music. The clashes with that. But there are other things around the types of information that you would return. And all of these details are in the paper. I'm just going to cover the broad outline here. One of the aspects that is slightly different, again, from the hole-in-the-wall work is that speech appliances, like the ones we're familiar with, are nowhere near as discoverable as a computer in a wall. There's no screen, there's no way of initially knowing that you have to say, OK, Google, or Hey, Siri, or all those sorts of keywords. So participants suggested other ways of waking this device, ranging from proximity to buttons to a range of other options. And finally, participants suggested a whole range of actual applications for speech appliances in public places. The most common suggestion was for wayfinding. As I mentioned, Maravi is a very compact, complex place. So there are a maze of alleyways and many different ways to get from one place to another. And at various times of the year or the day even, some routes will be blocked, others might be flooded. There might be something happening down one street that means you wouldn't want to go that way. So navigation was a key suggestion by participants, whether by a simple question and then maybe a very basic arrow displayed on a screen, not necessarily speech, or more complex, a network of speech devices that you might ask one and they get an answer on another as you moved around the space. And participants saw these devices as being most useful in very public spaces, so squares, bus stops, stations, and that sort of location. We used these insights and observations to develop a design space for public speech interaction. I'm not going to go into much detail about this because of the time, but we considered 4 different aspects, ranging from how you trigger the speech to how you interact in private versus in public, the way that you retrieve answers, whether you hear something immediately after you've asked the question, or whether you get the answer later, maybe on your own mobile or maybe on a different device, as I mentioned already. And finally, the comprehensiveness of the speech device. Would it be general purpose, like the ones that we're familiar with? Or would it be something far more simple and focused, like press a button to get the latest news, for example? So in phase 2 of this work, we created and deployed a probe of a general purpose speech appliance. After analyzing the results from our design workshops, we chose to create a comprehensive user-triggered system. So pretty similar to the sorts of like Google Home and Amazon Alexa systems. You walk up, ask a question, and get an answer. Now, because we wanted to test the best case scenario, we chose to do a Wizard of Oz type deployment. So we set up a system in the box that I showed on the previous page in the center of this photo. Inside that, we had a Bluetooth speaker and microphone that was connected to a phone, and then we had a phone call from that to 2 local researchers sitting in a room hidden away. Now, there are several reasons for this design choice, but one of the key aspects was language. As I'm sure you're aware, India has many, many languages. There are about 20 official languages, never mind hundreds of others. And we wanted to make sure that we could respond to all the sorts of queries that might be answered rather than having to decline some due to technical issues. So here you can see on the left the inside of the box, and on the right, Rini and Bhakti speaking. Rini spoke as a speech system might respond, and Bhakti looked up any potentially more difficult queries that people asked. We deployed this in several locations, both in Dharavi and also others nearby. Unlike the hole-in-the-wall system, we did play this in public, but like I've already mentioned about the discoverability, what we did was have one local researcher ask a single question at the start to demonstrate just that this was how it worked. And following this, we stood back and observed as Dharavi residents interacted. So just to briefly summarize the key results of this, there were what we saw as 4 different types of interactions with this system. There were basic facts, so things like who is the president of America. There were context-specific things like train times, local commodity prices, the weather and the news and things like that. There were more domain-specific queries, things like particular recipes. And there were also a small number of more philosophical questions, so things like where are you from? Not meaning a person, but meaning the device itself. Now, there are lots of similarities between the results that we got and other speech studies, but there are also some key differences. So I mentioned at the start that in our workshops, people were interested in directions, and in our actual deployment, that was the most commonly featured question category. But there are lots of things that people ask to speech appliances in homes and in offices that we didn't see at all. And obviously that's probably an artifact of the fact that this was a public space. But there are some things like setting timers and alarms and to-do lists that are very popular for you and I that we don't necessarily see as ever happening in this sort of public deployment. As far as the hole-in-the-wall experiments similarities go, like those studies, we saw children being the most keen to interact at first, but that sort of interaction led to further popularity with other types of users. Children led the way, but other people interacted after that. The hole-in-the-wall systems show lots of, some issues of kind of difficulties with usage based on the fact that there were lots of people around, and they also saw some small amounts of vandalism and just wear and tear. we only deployed for a very small amount of time in comparison, so didn't see any of those issues. But we did see interesting things like people trying to interact by shouting over one another, or people going very close and kind of whispering into the box, hey Google, listen really carefully, and things like that. And you can find all of these anecdotes and observations in the paper as well. So just to briefly cover a few of the challenges that we see going forward from this work and some of the limitations of this. Obviously, multiple user interaction with speech is a potentially difficult problem to solve. And we had a Wizard of Oz study, so we haven't solved any of these issues. But there is other research in CHI and in other HCI conferences about how you might solve this. So there's a very interesting paper about multi-mice use a few years ago, which offers one potential solution around sharing a single device. Privacy is clearly going to be something that we need to consider. And in our design space, we thought about potential solutions to private versus public use. But there's obviously a lot more work to be done in that area. One of the things that we don't necessarily know in our work is what people's awareness of the scope of the system is. So it's our assumption that, based on our workshop participants, most people did not have experience of internet search or the sort of capabilities of, say, Google or other web search engines. But for our actual users, we don't know what their ability was. And you might have seen on the system picture, we used the Google logo on the system without permission, I'm afraid. We chose to do that not because we work for Google or we wanted to try and pretend we were Google, but because Google is a heavily advertised brand recognizable as a high-tech company. And we wanted to show that this was a technology system. As Chris and other people have mentioned in the talks in this session, long-term sustainability of this sort of system is something that anyone working in this area needs to consider. One thing we are doing is working with a local audio service, a human-powered audio service, to think about ways to provide this sort of system going forward long-term. And our participants, in fact, themselves suggested ways of supporting this with things like adverts. They already use internet cafes supported by adverts, or also by micropayments. So that's another potential way of doing this. So to conclude, this is only a very brief early stage investigation, but I think there are a few key points that I want to get across from this work. Firstly, for you and I, speech systems like this are pretty much solely for getting basic information or for very simple tasks. The emergent users that we worked with saw far more benefits and a lot more potential uses. I'm not, and we're not claiming that speech is in any way a panacea. Speech is not going to solve interaction for the residents of Dharavi. But in the workshops and also in their interactions, it was clear that they saw speech as one way of interacting in combination with a lot of other modalities that they saw. So the message in this paper then is that speech is one of, speech can be in tandem with other modalities, and this work is a first step towards that. And with that, I'd like to conclude. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Yeah, hey, Axel. I just wondered if you have any, maybe you touched upon it a bit, but an understanding of what relationship they have to other kinds of technologies in their daily life, like, just in general.
Yeah, so like I said, we don't have that information for the participants, for the people who use the speech deployment, but in the workshops we do have that information. So most people either had access to or owned a very low-end smartphone. There's a lot of smartphone sharing, so people were familiar with a touchscreen with a phone, but data connections and internet access were not something that people had. So I think, like I mentioned about the sort of capability conditioning that was present, some people will have known about Google search, but not necessarily used it themselves. But like you say, it's something that we can definitely look into further. Hi, Jenny.
Jenny Priest, University of Maryland. Thank you for a nice talk. 2 quick questions. You didn't say anything about the sort of demography of the users. You mentioned that particularly kids got into this. So I wondered if it sort of was percolated through the whole age range and demography of the population. So that's the first question. And related to that, possibly, was I wondered if any of the people were kind of suspicious of the device. I mean, in this kind of community, there's probably run-in with authorities and this kind of thing. So I wondered if you came across those issues as well.
Sure. Thanks for the questions. The first one, so the demography, we just observed people, so we didn't actually measure demographics. So I can't give a concrete answer about the types of users, but like I said, children were the most keen initially. And that drew a crowd, and then more and more people came to interact. So I would say the majority children and then adults, kind of almost like taking over as the children had showed them. It was an interesting way of interacting.
What about suspicions about this
so
thing being placed there?
Yeah, there were comments about kind of what's this thing? What's it? This new thing that has just appeared in the middle of Derry. But there are also there are some artifacts of the fact that it was a Wizard of Oz study. So we had the first deployment. We stopped it after a short amount of time because one of the participants, their question was essentially, are you really a computer? This is a human, this is not a computer. So again, we didn't directly talk to participants about their feelings about the system, but some impressions were immediately obvious from that sort of interaction.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Jenny.
Hi, Max. I'm a PhD student at the University of Siegen in Germany. It's an interesting experimental project, but I was wondering what it was that, what do you think convinced your participants to take part in this, since you didn't leave anything to that people could do with, and with all the relationships that you made in that place, is there any way that you sustain it? Like, what's your relationship after the study ended?
Sure. So yeah, what convinced people to use it, I think, was probably there was definitely a novelty factor. This was the new thing that
not to use it, to participate in your study, like not after it was there, but to help you go on the technology walks and the entire project.
So we've been working with colleagues in IDC and IoT for many years, and they have a working relationship with various groups in Maravi, and I think we did reimburse participants. We paid them for their participation, so I think that obviously that is a way of convincing people to take part. As far as the long-term sustainability, participants themselves, like I said, did have some ideas about how that might work. What we are trying to do now is a further extended experiment that will be powered by human questioners and answerers. So a person asking a question might have a micropayment, and then someone answering a question would receive that payment. And of course, there are issues around power and network connectivity that can be funded by part of that, as well as the payments to the participants themselves. So I'm not trying to claim that we have an immediately long-term sustainable system, but that is definitely a consideration that we are working on. We're not ignoring that aspect.
Thanks.
Yeah, hi. Quickly first, do you know a project called Question Box? Have you ever seen a project called Question? Okay. Do you know if it's still active or?
It's hard to tell from, they have a website and they have adverts about the systems that they're doing. They definitely were very active for a period of time.
Yeah.
I don't know right now whether they are still active.
Yeah, I'm curious if they have anything to learn from. And I think, I think you're actually underselling in some cases the importance of voice. 40% of human languages have some kind of textual representation only, right? So we're talking about, epistemicide as people are forced to work with languages that do have written representations. So I think the idea of being able to maintain languages, but what's important is it's inconceivable that could happen computationally in the near future. So we're working with SERPROC and others who do TTS and speech recognition, and only the top languages are really served by the research community, and none of the methods that are currently being used work with a language that doesn't have written representations. I think really focusing on maintaining the Wizard of Oz I think should be, you know, a really important point for you to say, you know, how can this be done, but with real people on both sides of the conversation? Because I think the flexibility, the local knowledge, it'll have all these benefits in terms of use, and it's the only possibility for sustainability or serving minority languages.
Sure.
So yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, very interesting talk. Because of the strong kind of analogy that you build with the whole and all, I I'm curious, are you thinking of the kind of learning and education application of your device? Would that be like part of a system where like children will explore the computer using the voice rather than the kind of keyboard and mouth, like Sugata did?
I think that's definitely one potential application, but our interest in our focus on the hole in the wall was more about the deployment untended, essentially. So putting a system in place and seeing how people themselves discover how it would work. And I think, in Sugata Mitra's work, they initially had the same idea. So they didn't focus on education right from the start, but that became their primary focus after they had done that. So, I mean, like I've said to all of the questions, this is a very early deployment, and if that turns out to be one of the key aspects, then we'd be very interested in that.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Questions? Thank you very much, Simon.
Thanks.